We are live.
Yes, we are live now. Yes.
Hello. Can everyone
Hello.
hear me?
Yes.
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 Okay. Okay, welcome. Sorry about the rescheduling. But so for some of you are already familiar with the structure, we will have 3 questions for 60 minutes. Each question we will discuss for 20 minutes each. And the questions today are going to be focusing on the idea of collective practice. And I know I have started the conversation something to do with form and content, but I wanted to have a particular emphasis in this relationship. So I actually thought it would be a good idea to think about what happens when you produce in a collective space. So the first question that I want to discuss today is, what does it mean to produce in the presence of others? What does it mean to inhabit co-presences in terms of producing, whether it's producing creative work or actually producing anything? What does it mean? I'm just typing it out so people who with poor connectivity can hear.
I'm wondering if it just has to do with the presence of others. Because if you work together in a, let's say, company where you share one room, but everyone is working on his or her computer, is that collaborative practice? I'm not sure. Just the presence of others, I think, isn't it for collectivity?
But collective doesn't necessarily mean collaboration, right?
No, so go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just saying that the collective doesn't necessarily imply collaboration, right?
Well, yeah, that is exactly what my point is. So if we were to think about presences and not necessarily qualifying them as collectives, if you were to think about making something in the presences of others, like in terms of like I would not call it co-producing. Again, we go back to the question of collaborating, because it is not definitively to produce what the structure of collective is and collaboration is. It is actually to think about, as practitioners who are also individuals and also have done collaborations and worked in collectives, how do you then work with the idea of presences?
So you want
the
to
idea of
focus on the, so you do want to focus on co-production.
Yeah, partly, yes.
Yeah. Because I feel like even if you are not collaborating, just being in the presence of others could still have an influence, right? So there is an element of co-production, even though there isn't the intent of co-production.
Yeah, I agree. Even collective learning spaces or colleges end up doing that. That you are set in a certain environment and you're in the presence of certain people and discourses um, that will touch your processes in some way, even though obliquely.
Yeah.
Even if you're pursuing something that's more individualistic.
Well, Rebecca had actually interesting point saying that, you work in an office space and then we have other people working in it. It's also a presence, but you are actually either working towards something together or working independently on completely different things, which is a possibility. But it's also, if you were to say about I would not say the conscious, but in terms of thinking about that you're an individual person put in a context of a collaboration or collective, and then you're trying to like make sense of that dynamic and go towards producing something new. So that's also one of the facets that I was thinking about when I said that what does it mean to produce in the presence of others. It's also being yourself and being with others, and then what happens then to the idea of co-production or production itself.
I think one of the things that does occur to me that irrespective of whether or not collaboration is part of the equation, I think what a collective does is immediately the idea of perception is expanded a little bit, right? So if you're only making, I'm speaking, let's say, from the point of view of if you are producing something, whether it's usually which is in isolation, and suddenly you're in a sense in a collective, then the idea of collective perception comes in a way maybe which would, as you already have said, it would impact what you would make. So I suppose perception shifts. That's one of those things.
This is particularly Rohini in terms of, we had this conversation about the amateur, like, how amateur astronomers always have a more of like a collective. Yes, you have an individual perception of what you want to achieve. At the same time, it's also the idea that you want to do this as a group activity, or like in terms of as a shared perception, as exactly what you were saying, which
Yeah,
has,
but I'm also
sorry?
thinking that it covers even a physical space or a site, depending on what it is and where it is, how you perceive things in it, around it. All of that will be led and colored by what the collective is in that moment and space, right?
Yeah,
I'm
that
very
is the pressure of the collective.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Rohini, I'm very interested in what you're saying about connecting the collective to the idea of perception. Because I was thinking, how do we approach ideas of collectives which are not formed around? Because usually, whenever we say collective, we invoke the idea of commonality, right? That there is a collective
Yeah.
around a particular idea, or it could be a politics. It could be. It basically has to do with one perceived delineated object around which a collectivity is formed. But if we inverse this, for example, and we thought about ideas of collective formed around things that we don't know, that we don't perceive. And
Yeah.
in this, I think if one thinks of the idea of the secret. Okay, this is the concept of the secret. I think it's interesting. It's like the secret usually above anything else always forges its own collective. It forges its own alliances, its own affiliations, because the secret always becomes a kind of a hermetic adhesive between people involved in it,
Yeah.
as well as people who first see it revealed. And it's like the notion of the collective seems to be central to the idea of the secret. Whereas otherwise, we think of things that we don't know, we think of things those things in a kind of highly individual way. Because come to think of it, a secret is not quite simply that which is not known. It's about the active, restrictive distribution of what is not known from people between people. And
Yeah.
inherently in that way, it's always interested me that a lot of theorizing or a lot of philosophizing around the idea of the secret has to do with the fact that it is shared with somebody. It is a secret is between people. So the secret could be a political secret, it could be a public secret, it could be me staying in the pool alone, it could be somebody doing something at night alone, or it could be a mass political corruption secret. But it always is shared with somebody. Even in the earliest traditional theorizations of a secret, you would say that a secret is shared with God or shared with a confession box. So the act of sharing, or a formation of a pluralistic collective around it seems to inhere through all ideas of secrecy. And I think this sort of a inverse mirror image sort of thing becomes interesting in terms of how we using with collaboration, because I think it always forms through these sort of conversations between the perceptual and the non-perceptual.
But if you're saying that if it's a secret, that means it's also has the power of withholding, right? The power of withholding to something.
Yeah, and it's that withholding only which defines the collective. That's what I'm saying. That uh, secrets always work through who are the people who actively know, and who are the people who share the codes of uh, restricting the distribution of the knowledge. And I think I'm talking about the secret only as a kind of interesting sort of a conceptual tool through which one can think of the collective, because the secret is usually something which others think of the anti uh, collectivity or anti distribution, right? But I think it's an interesting sort of a conceptual node through which one can think of.
Yeah, it's a shared secrecy within a particular small number of group is what you're saying.
All kinds of secrecy have to do with some inherent act of sharing.
Okay.
But Shaunak, you said something which was about sharing with God or sharing with the confession space. In that case, Could the other be a non-human then?
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. Actually, and that's what I was also very interested in. So, uh, whenever one looks at theorizing of secrecy, I was saying that the idea of sharing inheres through all of it. Yeah. Now you can always say, but hang on, what if I have, for example, some say sexual fetish which nobody else in the world knows and only I know, right? And only I do it in the privacy of my room at whatever. Yet it's incredible how you read through Latin, early Latin, medieval writing on ideas of secrecy, Augustine, etc. And there's constant invocation of talking to either your conscience or to a confession or to God, as if there is a, there is a relational complex at play here. It seems like it's like you share it with a person. The person could be your own conscious. It could be a God. It could be, there is the idea of the other that is definitely
Yeah.
invoked in
There
it.
has to be a dialogue with
Yeah,
something else.
I do think it's relational like that. Yeah.
But what, for example, I'm just pushing it outside. So how do you think this kind of dynamic works in something like camaraderie? Like, if you were to think about it,
Can you expand on that?
if you were to say that secrecy is one of the conceptual ways to understand dynamics such as a collective,
Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand in the question, in the larger thing of camaraderie that happens with a lot of like of course politically inclined individuals in the country and across the world. How does one then when expand think about something like camaraderie?
Well, okay, let me just zoom out for a bit and say that if you look at the journey of any kind of a secret, it always, like, it has set stages in the way in which a secret comes out. Okay, and then I'll directly answer what I think is the response to what you're asking. Uh, so any secret at this moment of revelation, like at the point in which it gets exposed, कि जब बाहर आया secret, is the first stage is always this sort of an affective burst, right? When the explosion first happens. And then the secret inevitably transitions into knowledge, confession, evidence, and finally becomes subject to different kinds of cognitive judgment in terms of questions of veracity. Right? So, be it any kind of a public secret, be it, say, a Tehelka sting, which would first have a lot of sensational sort of this thing, then it would enter in the form of evidence and then enter into sort of public knowledge. I think even if you look at political history, so even if you look at different kinds of political genealogies, the secret as like ideas that somebody initially thinks of shares among a group of people, and then it starts increasing almost as a meme through different concentric circles in here, even through that. So I do think that the secret is a kind of a interesting bulwark political comrades in how how politics disseminate.
Okay, let's ask. Okay, there's one part of the house that's completely silent. So, building on the idea of secret as a way of engaging with the collective space? Any other responses?
Yeah.
I feel like there's this a thing about of identification over and above this idea of the secret. Even if something is not secret, or the moment that the secret is revealed, the sharing happens through some level of identification. I feel because it's the knowledge, the secret defines the collective. Yes, it defines who is included or what is included and what is excluded. But if you look at it from the other direction, moving from an individualistic point of view towards a kind of an open sharing, so the criteria for getting people or things together has to be some sense of commonality or identification, with or
Yes.
without that point of secrecy. I mean, that adds another dynamic, I agree, but um, I'm just wondering how it plays out in a kind of more open way.
Well, we're also talking about that way collective. We come back to the question of collective as a closed entity, right? And which is
I,
also uh, no,
is it closed?
no. That's why I'm saying if you're talking about secret in a collective space, I'm not limiting the potential of what it could be. Is it that I'm actually posing it as a question? Is it that we are thinking of collective as a closed entity, because then it has to restrain the secrets, right?
Or the secret binds it. It may be an open secret, but there are people who adhere to it.
It's the governing principle, you're saying.
Yeah, something like that. The philosophy, perhaps.
I see the idea of a collective more fluid.
Sorry, somebody. Sorry, what is it?
So that was
Nandita,
me.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was trying to intervene to say that I thought it might be interesting to go back to the original question, and I can't remember who said it, but someone was questioning the premise of assuming that we were talking about collectives to begin with, in the way that the question was framed, right? So what does it mean to produce in the presence of others? Doesn't really. So I was wondering whether we could broaden the terms of engagement by moving beyond collectives when we're thinking about presences. And so I have to admit that I don't know anybody else other than you and Shaunak on the panel. So I'll just sort of briefly say that I'm a PhD student, an anthropology PhD student. And one of the, like, in terms of my practice, I'm not a practitioner in that sense, but in terms of my practice, I am constantly producing in the presence of others, because anthropology is a kind of is knowledge production that valorizes engagement with other people, right? It's not texts, and it's not sort of sitting with books and ideas, but it's going out there and talking to people. So in that sense, the really banal and obvious thing to say is that all knowledge production is a kind of collective knowledge production. So if you want to then go back to the collective and explore what it means to talk about the collective, the question then is, what is not collective, right? Everything is always already collective, because all social practice is collective. And then maybe one way of bringing, like, Shaunak's point back into this is to then try and figure out the different ways that we mark off the collective as a specific, in fact, not collective thing. When you start defining boundaries around what is collective, that might be a way of thinking about.
That's the reason why I actually brought in presence as an idea, as opposed to like starting off with collective practice. Is that to understand the question of the collective seems to be so much about boundary, making some kind of boundaries. That way, presence is more open, as you're saying. And the question for me is then the idea of framing these presences, which is what is interesting. Like it's also yes, I agree that all knowledge production is actually happening in the presence of many other people, or yourself and many other people, or you're also part of this many other presences. But my interest is actually about, even if it's anthropology, art history, curatorial studies, all these kind of disciplines that we diversely engage with, how it's actually at the end framed as a knowledge production when it's out into certain kind of form.
Right.
As opposed to, sorry, yeah, Rohini?
No, I was just saying, I really liked what Nandita was saying, and it really helped. I think, so the other end of the spectrum is, so I'm an artist, and I agree, actually. I don't think there's any sort of solitary practice that is completely removed from a larger collective, if you like. But I was just thinking, it's interesting when I think of collective in that sense, then questions that it's so specific to the art world. I suppose what ends up happening a lot is, I read a really interesting article today which said that some people do not like to buy work that is created by a collective, because the question of authorship becomes a problem. And I think that that's really interesting, because the question of authorship and the collective, within the sense of the artist as being this kind of solitary character who sort of is the sole author of a work of art or something like that, which is, I mean, it's a different, sorry, this is tangential, but it's interesting how, for me, when I think of collective and working in the presence of other, what was the question which you started with, Aditya? The idea of,
in the presence of others.
Yeah,
so for me, the thing, it becomes a very different sort of question of actually where you do maybe have a solitary practice, if you're then making work or working together, and where it's a very different sort of
That's a good lead, actually. I'm just shuffling the questions a little and actually taking lead from what Rohini just said. So if we were to think about that, exactly taking cue from what you just said, then what happens to individual intellectual journeys in a collective space? If this is what we are actually saying, that everything is produced in a kind of collective space, and also on the other spectrum, there are people who are saying they don't want to buy art because they're made by collectives because they want individual ownership. Sorry.
Well, that was just one random article. I was just like putting it in there, but it's like not to be taken too seriously.
No, we can take it as the next question, saying that what happens to individual intellectual journeys in a collective space, then even if you were to think about the fiction of the collective space exists.
Yeah. Or even, in fact, the fiction of
I think it's the fiction of the individual space, actually. Yeah.
Okay, but I was just thinking, Namita, I had a question.
Sorry. Yeah.
I was saying, Namita, I had a question. This is very interesting. Also, in conjunction with what Rohini was saying, very often the idea of the individual is pegged onto the plane of perspective, especially visual perspective. Because there's a discourse that different kinds of textual produce could be collaborative, could be in partnership with other people. But when you have what are otherwise known as allographic arts, right? So, for example, photography, which I know you revel in, or different kinds of visual factors. There, the question of authorship or the individual becomes interesting because the eye is thought of as a hyper. Yet, of course, this is one of the central questions in cinema studies, wherein couched by the way of, say, around ideas of the auteur or different kinds of ways in which one tries to attribute authorship, that it's impossible, especially within the visual, it's very difficult to attribute any kind of authorial or individuated presence towards in the end, because it's not an orthographic art, it's a completely allographic sort of art. So it's interesting when Rohini says that people don't want to purchase something which is a sort of a collective or a pluralistic this thing. But how does visual anthropology negotiate with this?
I'm so sorry, just a second. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, has the conversation moved on? I got interrupted.
No, we were waiting.
Waiting for you.
Sorry. Shaunak, you'll have to encapsulate that into a slightly more streamlined form of thought for me to respond. I got, how does visual anthropology engage with, and then I'm sorry.
Engage with authorship, he said, right? No?
Yeah, no, I was just because it was interesting how you invoked anthropological practice in one thinks of the individual and the collective, and I was saying that very philosophically individual in the idea being that eyes are yours, that sort of a thing, that the photographer's eye is unique or this person's eye is unique, that it's a orthographic form and not an allographic form, which of course gets debunked completely in cinema because there is no one single author, etc. But when one is doing things like visual,
Okay, I think there's some disturbance.
Shaunak, it just occurred to me, is an individual eye still an individual eye? I mean, there's still the presence of other presences in the head, right? Even if a person, there's all these other influences.
Do you mean it in the sense of? You mean when you say in the head, do you mean like multiple presences that we are ourselves inhabiting at one point of time, or do you mean it in the sense of the machining also and other factors that mitigate the idea of?
See, I mean, everything is a multitude, really, isn't it? I mean, we are several individuals at the same time. Our thoughts are influenced by several individuals and influences. The apparati we use are also constructed because of several whatever. So, I mean, this, I'm not able to see individual anywhere now.
Shaunak, were you asking how individual perspectives are negotiated within anthropological practice? Is that it? Like, so I'm so sorry because I got called away again. I keep getting interrupted. Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh dear.
I can like give you the like Anthro 101, which is that
No, I meant it. Look, okay. Very quickly, I meant it in terms of the visual, because the visual and perspective is you very often thought of as aspects of individualistic projection.
right. Okay. Yeah, so actually this is true. I mean, I'm going to say that this is true for all social science and humanities knowledge production at the graduate student level. Like anyone doing a PhD basically falls into this mode of individual perspective, regardless of whether it's visual or otherwise, when they're producing knowledge, because there is this kind of enlightenment understanding of the single creative genius who has come up with their own research project and is going out into the world doing it and coming back, right? So actually, in a sense, it this is not true for science. Science does interesting, has other ways of, and in fact one can talk about form and content, because the social sciences and the humanities have different kinds of content that then lead to different kinds of forms, right? So in the sciences, I know this is not exactly answering your question, but this is the only way that I can think of responding to it. In the big sciences, you have collaboration as both means and method, right? Like you have to have a bunch of people that agree on an object, and part of the agreement is validation of the object itself. So there is a way that content, which is the object, dictates form, which is collaboration, which dictates content, which is so it's a like it's a but what happens in the social sciences and the humanities, I think, is that content as individualistic is valorized, which then like everyone is coming up with their own thing. There's no one big project that you are just a part of. And I think I think this goes for visual as well as regular forms in the sciences and social sciences and humanities. Yeah.
Well, that's the interesting part also, because, for example, if we were to think, then there is a particular kind of individualistic approach that is being valorized within the humanities or social sciences in any of so in visual arts, I have to say that the individualistic artistic genius is the thing. But it's interesting, for example, in the collective spaces, and which is what, just go back to the question that we started, is that somewhere the individual intellectual journey exists, but it doesn't exist in an extremely definitive way. And there is a certain kind of shared ambiguity that it entails, which seems to be going back to the secret that Shonak was talking about. Is that the thing? Like, in terms of, it's good because on the one hand you're trying to take collective knowledge and trying to put an individualistic streamline into it, as Nandita just said. On the other hand, there are a bunch of people who have their individual intellectual journeys, trying to produce an ambiguous relationship between a definitive idea of what their individualistic self is, if that makes sense.
I just wanted to go back to the knowledge production in the social sciences and just mention that even there, of course, you have to have an individual approach to something or a new thought, but that won't be accepted if you don't quote the right sources. So even there, you rely on the whole network that has been there before. And
Oh yeah, that's true. I mean, I agree with that. But the process of knowledge production, like sort of engaging with it, is a fairly isolated thing, I think, in the sciences and the social sciences. I'm sorry, in the humanities and the social sciences, as opposed to the sciences where you're in a collective. Right? I just meant it in that sense.
But maybe you can even see books as the others that you're surrounded by, and then you're part of the activity.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there's any such thing as the individual. Like no man is an island.
Okay, there's no such thing as an individual. Would you
Yeah,
like
which
to
is what I
elaborate?
was also, which is what had occurred to me earlier as well, which is like you are constantly in the presence of influences.
Mm-hmm. No, I just want to go back to what Rohini was talking about. I'm not very fan of speaking about authorship, but for the moment, let's just go back to the idea of individual and authorship.
Maybe
And
it's not even authorship. I was just thinking, even in terms of like, okay, production within a collective, there has to be. I think the question before this, when you're talking about the secret, also, I think there has to be some sort of a negotiation which happens, which is either tacit or it happens as part of the process of induction, if you like, where there is some level of trust and understanding that your individuality is given space. I do think that is part of this thing that we're talking about. You know what I mean? Like, so maybe authorship is the wrong word, but there's certainly some space given to maybe identity is not the right word either. I don't know.
you mean to say there is a certain space given to not dissolve themselves individually at the same time coexist? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
exactly. I mean, yeah. Because I mean, as Nandita mentioned, when it comes to the big sciences, if you're talking about the nature of collaboration, whether it's towards method or content, there are clear there are strategies, there are methodologies already in place. So if you co-author a paper, there is already certain whose name, you know what I mean, like whose name comes first. There are all of these codes which are already inbuilt. So I think that is part of the nature of this sort of a collective thing, right? I would imagine. I mean,
Yeah.
But then that takes me back. We have actually covered fair bit of understanding about co-presences, especially in not completely, but different disciplines. I would not, of course, from presence, I would like to actually go to think about if we were to think about that the collective practice as an idea today is very expansive and it has a way more bigger canvas than we imagine. Uh, I would like to think about what are the how do we read the different forms of collective practices today in terms of what are the yes, one is the idea of authorship and co-authorship, presence and co-presence, but what are the other ways? Secret, like one of the peg that came into being of different ways of reading these collective practices which seem to be reinventing themselves every day. And for me it's personally interesting because I think about collective space, especially online, and how it changes the whole dynamic of how we interact with each other, how we co-produce with each other. So maybe something to delve onto as the the third thing. How do we read the different forms of collective practice today?
I think when we are discussing about collectives, actually we are thinking about the possibility of forming some sort of camaraderie.
Mm-hmm.
I think this element of camaraderie is important in understanding any form of collective practice. And
Mm-hmm.
when we are going back to the notion of secrecy, I think secrecy
Mm-hmm.
is something that we share between friends, not between comrades, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, camaraderie demands some sort of transparency between the members of the collective, not secrecy. And
Mm-hmm.
secrecy, as if we understand it as a form of establishing friendship, it seems that even in a political organization, some sort of friendship is possible, all the while you are being comrades to each other. So in that way,
Mm-hmm.
like, we have to differentiate these different forms of collective practices. And I think when we are discussing about collective, we are actually talking about, certain form of camaraderie, not friendship. In that way, I think secrecy is an idea which largely misdirects the discussion, right? In fact, we should go away from the notion of secrecy and go back to the element of transparency between the members. If that is the case, then I think it's also wrong to start from the assumption that everyone is already a collective or there are no individuals. There are collections. I think this is also a wrong starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me of the criticism of Freudian psychology. This criticism was put forward by Voloshinov. His problem was this, that in Freudian psychology, an individual is considered to be a product of society, or individual is not considered to be, as individual. I mean, he is considered to be a collection of different of desire. So,
Mm-hmm. You're breaking in between, Sandeep.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
No, better.
Yeah. No, the problem is that if we start from this argument that there are no individuals, I think then there is no need to discuss collectives, the idea of collective,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
If I
when
could
we
just
talk,
say, just to say that I was just thinking in terms of even the secret. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think it can also be the basis of a camaraderie sort of experience, because it doesn't have to be necessarily exclusionary in its
Yeah,
entire definition. Because if you think of it like, we share a secret, we all know it, it's tacit, it's what binds us together. So for someone on the outside looking in, we know something they don't know, but it's not like it's, you know what I mean? Like any collective who is um, or but let's not use the word collective, any group of people who have a shared sense of anything, sense of commonality, for want of a different word, a sense of love for anything will have that sense that we share a secret. But the secret here doesn't become,
absolutely.
yeah,
That's Rohini, that's exactly how I also meant it. I meant it in the kind of like the secret being that which ignites the broadest kinds of affiliations between people.
yeah, yeah,
Both grant those a particular form of knowledge, or it could be a particular relation to the world. It could be a
yeah,
particular approach to anything, as well as the affiliation which is shared at the moment in which a secret comes out. The moment of revelation. Even that
yeah,
forms a
which could be, yeah, exactly, which could be completely experiential. It doesn't even have to be,
absolutely.
yeah, exactly. It doesn't have
I
to be a
don't
thing
mean
that
it
is
in the
told to you
sense.
by
I don't
someone.
mean it in the sense of like an extramarital affair happening and people going there. I mean it in the
Yeah,
broadest possible way of uh, forms of distribution of knowledge and people staking particular claims in it. And in that
yeah.
sense, I mean, secret. Go on, Sandeep. Go on.
yeah, no, like if you're talking about the knowledge sharing and all, it's not secret anymore. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Sorry, you have to be louder, Sandeep.
No, like no, the moment we share knowledge, I don't know like whether it can be called secret anymore. So actually, it is the end of secrecy the moment we share it. So to
But not
start
for
from
someone
there,
else, right?
Exactly.
sorry.
But not for somebody
I
else.
think a secret actually is becomes a secret when you decide who doesn't hear rather than who you're sharing it with. It's who's being excluded
Yeah.
that
It has an
defines that makes it a secret.
it has an
That
exclusivity
very
sentence.
conscious, yeah, the very conscious exclusion of a group or a set of people or specific people is what
Yeah.
ends up making things,
So my question though is that what if it's not in that sense of exclusivity? Supposing a few people have found something, for want of anything, I don't know, deep sea divers and their love of the reef, whatever it is, right? For whatever reason, they have found that experience. They have found people who share that. Now, would you say that is their secret? But I would not say that they are excluding people from that experience. You know what I mean?
That, and also, I mean, for example, if you take so Michael Taussig has this idea called the public secret, which is that when you know what not to know, it is a secret where everyone knows, but there's certain forms of publicity that the thing can't go. So for example, in India, say bribes, we know that for example, or corruption in different forms, that we know that at a certain point of time, to get say anything, a driver's license or any kind of a permit, you have to pay so and so, and this is a common form of distributed knowledge, right? It's a thing
Yeah.
that you see day in and day out. Yet it is only when say it's captured on camera and travels to say primetime television is when the crisis happens, because then the public secret moves into a different kind of a space, and there a kind of desacralization of the authority of say if it's the police which is caught, if whatever institution has been caught, then there's a kind of desacralization happen, and therefore it has to be addressed. But other than that, public secrets also work in exactly this sort of a way. It's common knowledge. It's a secret that perpetuates itself through knowledge. But it's not necessarily
yeah,
exclusive.
but a public secret is still part of a collective property in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely,
It's still something that a collective is sharing.
It's a
absolutely.
binding entity.
Yeah, it's a form of relation. I mean, it's a form of affiliation. Anyways, look, I invoke the secrecy idea only as a kind of inverse or a obverse way to think about the collective or the idea perception. But I mean, I don't want to be I mean, of course, there is much more to the collective than just the secret. Of course.
Okay.
I think
Any other thoughts other than the secret? Sorry. Go ahead, Sandeep.
I think instead of secrecy, we can think about faith, right? Or faith in the possible future that we can build together. And it also has a certain religious dimensions to have faith or to have a fidelity towards certain cause and all. So it's also an effective notion that would bind people together. So I think the faith is not something that we always, share between people. Also something that we present in front of a public. Actually, there is no secrecy in having a faith, but it's a complicated, practice. I know it is, but my point is that in a forming collective, we always address certain public, right? We always try to convince people. So actually, the notion of collective in art history, if we are talking talking about its beginning from modernism onward, just basically a kind of confrontation of a public sphere, right? Convincing people and also asking the people to join the group or the collective and so on. But this kind of collective practice does not exist today. I mean, it's not a cynical position that I'm making, but still, think about all the Indian art collectives today. They are in terms of other function, they are artist function, they work just like any other individual, right? So there is no manifesto, there is no kind of declaration of people coming together for so and so cause or so and so reason. So that is not made public, or that is not made into the form of an invitation, public invitation and all. So I think when we are talking about collective, actually we are talking about certain kind of openness, right? Like coming together of people and also expecting more people to join. Maybe or maybe because of sharing certain faith or certain commitment towards certain cause and all. So I think that is what we are actually trying to formulate when we are talking about our collective today, right?
But if we look at the idea of a collective outside of the space of the arts, and if you think of how programmers work and how the community of coders and open source developers exists today, it's uh, uh, it's quite different, and that entire field is in some ways far more open with sharing and putting things out there for the commons to use. We so I My comment is only coming from this idea of, how are we looking at collectives? Are we only understanding collectives from this kind of a cultural arts practice kind of space, or are we also looking at collective in a slightly more abstracted and um, a real world space of, or philosophical space of uh, sharing and
Which
transparency?
Yeah, which is also the point. Like, how do you actually, especially after the digital, this is my argument that I make, that, after the digital, what constitutes a collective practice is expanded, which is what just Malvika has said about coding and open source and all of these practices that do venture upon co-presences, let's not call collectives, but co-presences involved in a particular process of production. But then for me, that is why the presence comes as opposed to the collective, and that's why it's interesting whether to think about collective as a limiting category as opposed to presence, which is much more expansive, open-ended, and has a kind of a ring that talks about a larger element within the public sphere, as opposed to something that has a very definitive historical and political function, or has had, which will bring its baggage with itself.
Do you also mean networks if you say co-presences? I think that's the new and interesting part of artist collectives that formed after 1990, which were not artist groups, that were very local and not producing under one name, but doing exhibitions together, for example. But
Yeah.
then the internet, they became sort of networks that were not fixed to one locality, but global networks in a sort.
I think that's what actually I'm trying to head towards, because yes, there is a history within a history of collectives within art history that have a particular authorial and also political function. But I think over the past 2 decades, we have gone to a completely different, which is what just Rebecca has pointed out, that these are more of a network-based collectives, that not collectives, I would say, I would not call co-workers, but however we would like to uh, term the coming together. And it's important to think about whether we call that a collective practice, or we would like to go back to another expansive logic of referring to exactly even what we are doing today, or we are trying to produce today, or surfacial as a group of three people located in three different parts of the world trying to come together to produce something.
I feel like when you talk of practice, it immediately refers to something that is being done or attempted again and again. So it refers to what is being produced. In the network, it is yes, a nice term, but any part of the network can get activated and produce something at any point of time. So in that sense, the network offers that flux and fluidity for uh, a collective to exist. It just connects people or makes possible many more connections in maybe unpredictable ways even. Um, but what is being produced is my question. Is that what we are trying to examine, or are we examining the form of this network, the form or the function? In some ways, that's I don't know where this is really going.
Uh, uh, I'm going to take a sort of like slightly different response to that. Like, what is this produced? So, there's usually this sort of a banal platitude, which is to say that the sum of that the whole is larger than the sum of its parts. That there might be different kinds of impulses. So this is applied everywhere, right? That a collective of artists, their work is far greater than what just the three of them individually or together could have produced. It's as if the zone of togetherness itself produces a kind of a kind of a produce which is much larger than what just the individuals together could have done. I mean, these lines are usually cliches, but my main interest in this comes from a sort of a biological perspective, which is from emergence. Emergence. That, very often, what happens is that there are different kinds of organisms, and you see this across a range of both species and practices, and actually within human societies, which is that different kinds of agglomerations happen and yield producers that are unbelievable. So just to give you examples, so ants, for example, are often hailed for this, right? That a single ant or 10 ants or 15 ants, you will not be able to home into food or a secure space, etc. if you left them. You introduce 100, there's still complete chaos, complete sort of like they don't know what to do, etc. You introduce 200 more, nothing. You introduce 300 more, nothing. Suddenly, at some point after a number is introduced, it's almost as if a thing snaps in, and immediately they form into a straight line and start homing into food sources with exponentially more efficiency than the one ant lesser. Similarly, we see this in a number of different kinds of species where the collective in itself seems to become a supra sort of a intelligent organization. It's far bigger than the individual. So it's as if the whole solution is exponentially more. We see this in different kinds of other kinds of speech as well as human. Biologists will talk about how the brain also works through this kind of emergence.
Yeah, like the emergence of consciousness.
Yeah, where you can't really situate or place it within any one particular, say, the neurofrontal cortex or any other part. But sociologically, I'm quite interested in how this works out because traditionally it's been thought that unlike other things, if you leave 100, if you leave 1,000 humans in it and expect order or a greater efficiency to happen, it just never happens, right? Because it's almost like there's only more chaos when it does. But different kinds of, say, urban theory would talk about how city formations, etc., can also be looked at forms of emergence. Similarly, in there's Greenblatt experiment, which was this mathematician who went to a country fair, and where there was this competition which was happening. So they bought this huge cow, okay, big cow, and they were asking village folk to guess the weight, and whoever would guess it would win. Ah. So many guesses were made, and some were completely off, some were close, etc. And then at the end, he did a sort of average or a median of the whole of the number of guesses, and he realized that the average was closest to the actual weight. And therein, mathematically started to work around a probabilistic idea of emergence. I don't necessarily espouse to any of these ideas, but what I'm interested in is a relationship between the individual and the whole, and how the whole seems to embody, which I also think is a bit of a like a it has a theological sort of aspect to it. But this idea of the collective, which is almost unimpeachably larger, better, more efficient than the singular.
No, it's actually interesting. This reminds me of a statement that this African American curator who the African Okui Envisor makes about collectives, art collectives very specifically, where he talks about that the modernist idealization of the work of art as the unique object of individual creativity is confronted with the simultaneous aporia of presences within collective practices, and he thinks that this lends the collective work primarily a social character than of a person's individual character, which is a very, I mean, I'm not saying I agree to it, but it is something, a distinction that is worth like probing into. Like somebody is saying that the collective, by virtue of producing this ambiguity of not having a individual definitive stand, is producing for something a social character, as opposed to an individual who is like, whether his practice is linked to his biographical or personal kind of character. Rohini, what do you think?
I mean, there was something else I was reading about, which was talking about how the collective is reality. So, in a sense, I mean, it's not what Shaunak was saying, but something about the idea that it's sort of the other way around as well, right? Like whatever you perceive as being reality is collective, but who's collective and who is defining what is, you know what I mean? Like this idea of this mass of information and who decides what is true and happening and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, I mean, slightly frightening actually. But, you know.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes. Any remarks from this house that was silent?
No, that's,
Sandeep,
Yeah.
Nandita, and Rebecca.
I think the question of hierarchies is also interesting to look at if you look at a collective or the idea of a collective, as opposed to earlier groups that call themselves groups. I'm always looking at the term that the people who came together used. I'm not attributing that term to them. And I think this utopia of getting away from hierarchies is something that defines not all, but probably many contemporary collectives, not only breaking away from authorship, as we said, or from locality, but also from this strong question of hierarchies in the art world, where you don't have a gallery system, you don't have a gallerist, but you produce and you sell on your own and show on your own. But not, I mean, on your own means in this new structure, which is breaking away from the old structure, but then of course you're creating a new kind of network that can be questioned and criticized as well.
So you're saying that it generates hierarchies, or it engages with hierarchies in a new way?
It tries to break away from hierarchies, but as we see, it creates new hierarchies as well.
It comes a new set of like things to itself.
Yeah, for example, if you have a group which consists of people from different backgrounds or different professions, if you have curators and artists coming together, there must always be a sort of hierarchy that you try to break away from, but you never can, I suppose.
I think certain loneliness of the collective also has to be, thought about, right?
Sorry, you have to be a little louder, Sandeep.
Being collective, the loneliness of collective. No, it had happened in history where like people had come together and they failed to convince other people, certain isolation that they feel, right? So in fact, as mentioned in regarding the communist history, that was the most lonely collective project which had ever taken place in history.
Which one?
Right.
Sorry, repeat. I think we lost you.
Communist movement.
Communist movement. Okay.
The loneliest collective project. So I think this also need to be.
The loneliest collective movement. Communists are going to kill us. Okay, on the loneliest. Any final notes? We have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I was quite interested in how Shaunak illustrated the thing about the ants, and I'm connecting it with what Rebecca mentioned about the network, because you can have a network, but to have an active network where that network is there's this moment when things fall into place, and what is just a network can become something far more. It can become an entire uprising, or it can become an entire revolt or revolution. So I'm interested in that moment when things flip and something just changes. It completely transforms, and I think that that moment actually defines that mechanism of uh, collective practice in some ways, because maybe it's in that transformation that the individual journey actually changes.
So we'll talk about the individual more tomorrow. I think we are now done for our time for today. And then, yeah, thank you. And I will see you all tomorrow.
Yeah, and we'll send the link tomorrow before we start.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you.